Hey, it's Dr. Trek, Larry Nemecek, coming to you from Trekland here, host of the Trek Files, leader of Portal 47 backstage, Trekland Treks, everything good about Trekland, and you're listening to Trek Untold.
Hello and welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. The moment that a person starts to delve deeper into something that they like often leads them down the road of fandom. It's when this show or this book or whatever it could be evolves to have a deeper connection and a larger meaning to the consumer of whatever this media is, and in turn, introduces them to a whole new world and community at large of like-minded individuals. For Star Trek fans, we go by many different names, including Trekkies, Trekkers, Niners, or whatever. But in every community, the good comes with the bad. And while there are plenty of supportive fans out there, the opposite is true too with toxic fans, or even gatekeepers, that have no problem letting everyone know how much they dislike something. This week on Trek Untold, we're discussing fandom and how the fandom works around Star Trek, particularly the history of it, and what it means today to be a part of the Star Trek community at large. And what better person to chat with about this than Dr. Trek himself, Mr. Larry Nemecek. Larry has run his Trekland operation for over 25 years now, which includes his podcast, The Trek Files, and Trekland Tuesdays Live on Facebook and YouTube, along with another live show that he does with Dr. Ali Matu, Life Support Live. Larry is an archivist of Star Trek history, an author of several Star Trek books, and even wrote an episode of Voyager from the last season of it called The Prophecy. He's also appeared in an episode of Enterprise, and if you've ever seen the Star Trek Continue series on YouTube, you also know him as the original Dr. McCoy. And of course, being in this community as long as he's been to plenty of conventions, not just as a guest, but he also runs his own cons and has traveled across the country doing panels at shows across the nation. Basically, Larry has done it all and gone from a Star Trek fan to a Star Trek professional over the course of a lifetime of hard work and passion for this franchise. It's safe to say Larry has been a lover of Star Trek longer than I've been alive. And he has seen the fandom change and evolve with every series that has come out since he first discovered the show as a kid. So in this episode, we talked to Larry not just about his journey in Star Trek and the road he had to get to where he is today, but we also examined the state of the Star Trek fandom, take a look at where we're at, and think about where we're headed. So stick around and enjoy this great discussion with Dr. Trek all about, well, all of us. But before we begin this week's episode, if you'd like to support this show, please don't forget to follow Trek Untold on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to get the latest updates and all sorts of other fun Star Trek-related content. You can also check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/trekuntold, where you can support this show for as little as $2 a month. At higher tiers, you can check out the shows before they come out, know about my guests in advance, and even have a chance to ask them questions, among other benefits coming soon. Shout out to our sponsor, Triple Fiction Productions, who create 3D printed toys and prop replicas inspired by Star Trek. Their items come in all shapes and all sizes and are always amazing, but you're going to hear a little bit more about them later on in the show. If you're listening to us on iTunes or any other audio platform that allows for ratings and reviews, please leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to us at youtube.com/nerdnewstoday and give the video a thumbs up and a comment. Doing any of those things help keep this show growing and allow me to continue bringing you awesome guests and great conversations every single week. Now, without further ado, let's beam in this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. And welcome back to Trek Untold. And now joining us on the other side of the screen, you may know him as Dr. Trek. We have the man himself. We've got well, there he is. He's right there. Mr. Larry Nemecek. Larry, how's it going today?
It's good. It's good. I just was looking around to see how many sides of the screen there could be, but I guess we've got 2, and that's good enough.
There's a lot of parallel dimensions out there, so really there's like infinite screens. You want to get into that.
Mm-hmm. It's the multi-screen, yes.
Infinite screens on infinite Zoom sessions.
That's 2022, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Larry, I know you are a very, very busy man over in Trekland, which is your family of different sites and things you do on your YouTube channel. So for folks who might not know about you, which if they don't, shame on them for not, but for folks who are new, maybe it's the first time hearing about Larry Nemecek, Tell us a little about what you do and what's going on your channel.
Oh, I love when you say channel like it's all one compact thing or it's new or something. So
There's a whole
yeah,
lot of
so
other things
no,
in that. I know that much.
I've well, basically everything I really, really, really enjoy doing is kind of my original twin interests of the background of Star Trek, both now we'd say the canon and all that is. And canon is not a C word. It's not a dirty word, but it's not something mystical. So we can talk about that too, because that sure interfaces with fandom, but also the making of the people that made it and why they did what they do and did and what their philosophies are and why they didn't do what they did and do, and the people at the top and the people on the bottom in the creative food chain. And the obvious is falling in love with the world of Star Trek and the universe, and then after a few years go by and then you start to be savvy. I was, and then I like watching new fans go that route too and helping them. That's kind of what life has become about. In fact, now I feel like I'm servicing the the hosting and the interviewing, and that is not getting to indulge my own. I just want to sit down in encyclopedia eyes, concordance eyes, everything that's new that's coming out, and dive and then chase things down and chase that model maker or that costumer or that writer and ask them about it. And I know I've got to keep the wheels rolling on on the podcasts and the shows and Portal 47, the business and all of that. And there's times when I wish I could just sit down and come home from work, my day job, and then just work on backgrounding for fun. So anyway, it's a juggle now, but you've got to have one with the other, and it's all what I love. Aside from having non-Star Trek gasp interests.
Yeah, I mean, and basically Trekland folks who don't know entirely about it, there's all sorts of things going on there, like Larry just mentioned. And if you are a fan of my kind of podcast, my kind of show, which is what we do here, deep dives, Larry goes even deeper. Because he's got literally an encyclopedia of knowledge in that brain of his about this franchise. So, I think today you're going to hear a lot about that.
Well, people talk about brains and trivia and all that. I say, like I do know a lot, but there's a lot of new that's being cranked out now. You got to keep up with. But
that's true.
I don't claim to have everything. Don't catch me flat-footed on trivia or something. But if I don't have it right off, I know where to go look at or who to ask, or I know where the bodies are buried. Hopefully, so between all of that, we'll get there.
As much you think you know about a franchise, there's always more to learn.
Well, that's true. That's true. And a lot of it, the more time goes by, everybody comes to Star Trek from where they are, from their generation, the way they were raised, the culture around them, and also the Star Trek that's their first. And that's what's great and lovely. And everybody has their, first Star Trek story, but everybody comes, as long as you came to it after 1964 or 66, then everybody came in with something having gone before, and everybody understands the past in a different way. Those who lived the 60s, or those who lived week to week Berman era unfolding, right? Or those who came in during the droughts or the movies only, or the complete drought between, I shouldn't say that because the Kelvin movies were there, but they were fake Trek. They weren't even the Prime Universe. So, and good on them. I'm not knocking for that reason, but I'm just saying we didn't get back and rebuild, the core universe of Star Trek for 12 years. So anyway, but people all come to that at different places. And part of what I've done is we all come in, and we intentionally or not, we come in with blinders on. And one of the things I try to do is gently, and I carry my own, believe me, but I try to gently remind everybody that, if you weren't alive then, this is what happened here. This is what's colored people's perception. This is why this survived. And before you go off on a tirade here or a platform, this happened, this is not the first time this has happened. I mean, all those kinds of awarenesses, if I can bring something like that, or if I can go and hunt them down and bring them in, that's what I try to do too, because this is supposed to be it's supposed to be a magnet for people, for positivity, or for people get something out of it that makes them a fan, or else they wouldn't be a fan. So why not either not, get rid of the negativity, and I'm not talking about critiques, but why not either get rid of the negativity, or just here's all the layers you had no idea about because of where you are, and that's cool. And some things we're all still learning together. So
yeah, there's for sure a lot to unpack about the fandom and that kind of thing. But earlier in your answer, you said something that is the perfect segue to my first question that I always ask my guests first here. And that would be, Larry, what's your earliest memory of Star Trek? And I'm very interested in hearing this.
Okay, so when I was a kid, my older brother was 10 years older than me. And I vaguely remember, I remember Lost in Space being on TV, and I remember watching, and I was way too young to have it, this is cheesy, but I remember playing Lost in Space at school at recess, and my brother running the TV, controlling the TV when my parents didn't. And I remember vaguely there was another space show on about a guy with ears or something, but I didn't watch it, and nobody in the house cared about it. And I vaguely remember thinking if it was a guy with ears, it might be scary. And maybe when I was that little, I didn't want to watch. And then I remember vaguely a few years later, some weekend flipping channels, back when we actually flipped channels, and coming across vaguely recognizing it was that show and the guy with the ears. And I can remember this though. It was like Sunday afternoon, and these guys were walking down a hall, and there was this floaty energy ball thing kind of tailing behind them, or they were following it. And I was like, oh, there's that show with the guy with the, anyway, it really came to a head with in ninth grade, my science teacher one day was, long story short, was kidding around with some other students, and they were all Trek people. And basically the upshot, I waddled into it, not knowing what they were doing. And after a couple of times, she realized I had no clue what they were doing. And I just will always remember, I'll never forget her looking at me and saying, oh, Larry, don't tell me you don't know Star Trek. And she's like, go home and watch it after school right now, 4:00. And I remember thinking, okay, I'll watch it, but isn't it on as a cartoon also? I'm going to watch the cartoon first. This made some logic to me at the time. I don't know why. I'm going to watch the cartoon first. And if I can stomach the cartoon, or if the cartoon looks attractive to me, then I'll take a chance on the live show. That made some sense to me at the time. I don't know. But I was a rerun baby. And yeah, it took about a week or two to totally get sucked in and not even realize you were sucked in. And, daily reruns, they recycled the 79, 80 shows. That's about 3 months, 5 days a week. So what I didn't know was the weekend I saw, Day of the Dove was what I saw, and didn't know what I was watching, obviously. But it was so strange. In the school days, they would show Channel 5, ABC affiliate in Oklahoma City, would show Star Trek at 4, and they would it was the worst of the syndication. They would cut scenes to cram in more commercials. And not only that, they would cut the teaser and the voiceover. You'd get okay, kiddies, here's the way it used to be before we had, before streaming, before we had tapes and DVDs. You'd have the station ID at the top of the hour. Ding, you're watching 5 KOCO TV in Oklahoma City. I mean, they'd cut the teaser and cut the voiceover, and where no man has gone before, and that's where it would start. So you'd get that for just a second, and then more commercials, and then come back to acting. Yeah,
that's the worst.
So when I went to college, and we had a super cable station in the dorm lounge, and then when we got TVs in our rooms, it was like a whole nother. It's like, oh, that's where all those clips I keep seeing in books are from. Like, there was so much info in the teasers a lot of times that some of the factoids and some of the scenes. So it was like a few years later, I got a whole different. I had another little. It's like little lost episodes. But anyway, that's how it was in the day. But that was my intro. And then after the first time I went in to get a book, I didn't read fiction, but I was reading the background books, and I got The Making of Star Trek and The World of Star Trek and the Tech Manual. And I can remember the story behind all of these books, and a couple of them were Christmas gifts when I finally convinced my mom this was serious. But I remember I think it was The Making of Star Trek and something else. And I remember the guy at B. Dalton's looked at me at the mall and said, yeah, we try to keep all the Star Trek stuff in stock for all you Trekkies. And I was like, oh, is that what I am now? Okay. Okay, I guess so. But yeah, so there's some of my earlier moments.
That's the secret origin of Larry Nemecek Trekkie, which is pretty cool. Yeah. So, and on this show too, we like to kind of go back in the past and examine the things that brought people to where they are today. And in your case, we're talking about fans and fandom. And before you were Dr. Trek, you were a fan. And here you are telling us about how you first discovered the show, getting your hands on a book for the very first time. And you've then since gone on to write entire books. You've written the episode of Voyager we talked about. You showed up on an episode of Enterprise. I mean, you're living the dream. But today you've got this empire of your own, if you will. So I feel like
step one. The hope. That's
Yeah,
the hook.
I'm going to call it that because that's what I feel like you have. So, I feel like step one of your path probably began with your fanzine, right? Like, was that kind of your first time getting your toes wet in the world of fandom in a bigger way, or is there something else I'm missing before then?
The very first thing I did was get the Making of Star Trek, Stephen Whitfield's book, and love it, and then go crazy because there's no index and there's no, there's no way to tell. He's got pieces scattered all through the book. And so the first thing I did was take chunks of his book and type it up in like an 8 or 10 page guide where if you wanted to just look at everything alphabetically, phasers, shields, transporters, turbo lifts,
So
it
you
was
made your
all
own glossary,
there.
basically.
Yeah. I did my own little mini based on his book. But then there's a whole story where I shamed my mom in not getting me a tech manual for Christmas because it was about, she said, oh, I showed her in the mall. She's like, oh, Larry, $5.95 for something that doesn't really exist. And I was like, okay. So with my own money on spring break, I stayed with my brother at his college for a week and went down and found one and got it. But when I saw the tech manual and they had like all, it was ingenious because he was trying to imply the universe beyond. And in a money, in a model, in a business model, you're not going to have a 5,000 page book. Who's going to buy that? So he's done this, but he's expanded the Star Trek imagination by having all the other pages in the index that you just don't happen to see, or that didn't. There's a little meme behind the story of the tech manual that it was transferred to the Omaha Air Base like in Tomorrow's Yesterday. But I remember thinking, well, where's all these other pages he talks about? So I was like making up my own pages to fill in. And then when Bjo's Concordance came out, and I'd always enjoyed astronomy and star watching, I realized when you saw them all together, how many stars and planets there were. I was like, look at all these stars and planets. They're just like not organized at all. And I knew a lot of them, like Alpha Centauri. Well, that's, Rigel and Capella, and, go down the list. They're obviously real stars. So I was intrigued. And then Franz Joseph had tried to do a star chart where he took a very basic approach to here are the real stars. And he did a few story clues, story points around what that would look like for the fictitious stars. Anyway, that became like this passion where I started off, I was getting all the real astronomy I could get. And some of these are obscure stars. And I finally like wrote a letter to the Harvard Observatory, and some grad student wrote me back with spectral classes and distances that something wasn't available in my local library. But I was like for a year or two hunting. So I platted all this out. And then in the old days had hand rubbed letraset letters and made some rough charts, and then made a big wall chart that I've still got over here. And then to correspond with Jeff Mandel back when he was a fan and was doing techie behind the scenes blueprints and things. And then he was putting out a new book, and he said, oh, let's put this in the book. And he put it in his format. And then everything blew up with my first lesson in the way the real world works. A pouch of maps called the Star Trek Maps that came out in 1979, right before the motion picture. And it was a better scale and layout than what Franz Joseph had done in the tech manual. It made a lot more sense for the scale of warp drive. And sorry if I'm getting in the weeds here, but basically 90% of what I had done was no good now because it wasn't based on his scale and layout and nomenclature. So I got burned. But as a reward, Jeff filled up a lot of space with some joke stars and what I call patronage stars. And there's a Nemecek star in that. And so aside from my friends teasing me, oh, Larry, show us your star. The thing didn't sell. It instantly became collectible because it didn't sell because the license was going away and Pocketbooks got the license. And the world, stood up now with the motion picture, and we were off on kind of a new era. But I got teased about that for forever. So kind of in defiance, My Star Media and My Star Press and the finger pointing at the star, which was my original kind of shingle, that was all kind of like thumbing my nose at getting screwed that way. Because I never got any copies. And it wasn't Jeff's fault. It was powers that be. So number one, when TNG came back and all that, it was also kind of the Macintosh revolution and the laser printer revolution. And I jumped back in some ways and started working on kind of an a Bjo Concordance kind of guide for next gen. And that's what got me on the path to where we are today. And then years later, Mike Okuda finally came up with a Canon rough, the quadrant system and where all the big empires roughly are. And then Jeff winds up working on the movies and the series. he was a kid in New York, I was a kid in Oklahoma, and he's working on the series, and he's putting a lot of this into practice and making it canon on Voyager and Enterprise, and then does the book in the charts. And we're working he asked me to help him, and so we're kind of working together again. It was so weird. It was like we were kids, and now we're both in LA and working on this. And then stellar cartography was kind of the next phase of that, where it was all big wall charts, and I got to write some narrative explanations for that. So that's a long winding road there, and I'm sorry to go on about it, but it's a case where you take your fanish impulse and your other hobbies, and they all get mixed together, and you start down this path. And if you put a little more oomph into it, it might get noticed. And then also, the technology changes and who knows what can happen. But that's a crazy road that's wound up with the stellar cartography maps. But it actually, that was my first real big oomph in fandom, and it's still in my life today, which is crazy.
I mean, as they say on Enterprise, it's been a long road getting from here to there, right? But I'll spare you any further Enterprise jokes. But it does kind of remind me of another story outside of Star Trek, and that's in the world of pro wrestling, where we have guys like Dave Meltzer, who started his newsletter, or guys like that who basically made a newsletter, and were basically outsiders looking in. And fast forward to now, and they're insiders looking in, telling all of us what's going on. So it's pretty cool when worlds collide like that.
It is, and it's like whenever there's a pivot point, either in Star Trek world or in the greater culture, right? When the technology, it's like Tony at trekmovie.com popped up when everything else fell apart, and he cultivated a relationship with Bob Orsi and Evan and Kurtzman, especially Bob Orsi, and then he turned that into reporting on the first movie rumors, and then built Trek Movie from that. The same way Dan Madsen built the official fan club originally, and then did the Star Wars and the Lucasfilm fan clubs. But the way my concordance that I finally did, it wasn't even my first choice, but when they saw that, that got the attention to do the TNG companion. I thought I had a book already ready to go, but they'd already decided to have Mike and Denise do a whole new encyclopedia that combined, Bjo's original series concordance with like what I was doing, and then be ready to go on, because the eyes were forward. Like there are going to be more than one series. I was just thinking, well, you've got Bjo's, now I'll publish mine. It's already done. But no, it has to be a behind the scenes, and then I'm terrified that they give me 3 months to do a behind the scenes book. And I'm thinking, my idol here, or my influence, Stephen Whitfield's Making of, and it's been on people's shelves for 20 and 30 years. And if I'm going to do something in 3 months, that all I have trivia and data points and credits, but I have not interviewed anybody the way he did. And I don't want to be a laughing stock, or disdained by fandom and be that crappy ripoff guy that they want $20 for. I'm just, terrified. And it wound up being 6 months rather than 3 months, thanks to Leonard being mad at licensing about the Fruity Pebbles Barney's Pointed Ears commercial.
That's a story.
So I got more. Yeah. So it's like I learned so many lessons having nothing handed to me. And one of them was, it's Hollywood. The pictures are always worth more than the words. People always care more about the pictures than the words, even when it's like you're writing this, chapter book, this behind the scenes book, and an image like that can get you, twice as much time as you thought you were going to have. So anyway, but that was like, pedaling as fast as you can, dancing as fast as you can through fear, also knowing that the weight of the world, knowing there are a lot of these authors they use, especially in the 70s and 80s, they would contract with, who didn't care a flip of it. It was like, it was just another job, and they'd come in. Same thing happens sometimes behind the scenes on the shows. It's a job. They come in, they're professional, but there's not, I don't want to even say the love. There's not the between the lines, the between the cracks to it.
There's no real.
And there are some people that come to it and they feel all like I do, like I'm sure Denise and Mike did, but they were working on the show. They had an in there. But anybody who feels the pressure because they know what Star Trek is and fandom is, and they know the history, they know what has been a staple and what's fallen by the wayside, what people still ridicule, or what's been a treasured part of the shelf. That's mean. when you feel like if you've been handed a suicide mission and it's like, I've got to pull this off. So, a lot of things you're not happy about, but it's the 3 editions of the companion now there, and there'll be future books. There's another next gen book coming out, now, but I know a lot of people that'll be on their, a lot of the basic stuff we got into print back in the day when we weren't getting paid for it, but still crammed it in there because it ought to be in there. But those are all sagas. I'm just really happy and blessed that somebody noticed that I made enough noise, somebody else noticed, and then things aligned so that you could, get asked. And then we eventually moved to LA. And for 15 years, there's more Star Trek than we can keep up with.
Right. It's insane times we live in right now.
Yeah.
But, I'm glad you mentioned Bjo's name a few times now in this interview, because she's someone I want to spend some time talking about. Because, if we're talking about fans, Bjo is the original super fan. So if you wouldn't mind, can you kind of educate my audience on who the Trimbles are and why they're so important to Star Trek history?
Oh, I should. Yeah. See, I try to always do this. And then there's times when I forget. So Bjo and John Trimble were science fiction fans. They were in lit fandom. They were at the Worldcon when Gene showed up in 1966 at Cleveland with copies of The Cage and Where No Man, and he's going to show them. And he actually brings along a couple of costumes that had been filmed in that no one had seen yet, because the show hasn't. This is like the weekend before the show premieres in 1966, Labor Day weekend-ish, before, the famous September 8th, start date, although it was 2 days earlier than that in Canada. But he models a Romulan uniform from Balance of Terror, and they're one of their cosplay. Well, now we say cosplay. One of the costuming people, one of the young women that modeled, wore Andrea's suit from What Are Little Girls Made Of? That, very revealing. You had to have a certain body type to be able to pull that off.
One of my favorite outfits.
And yes, it's kind of timeless. And the fact that he was there promoting it on his own almost, because science, it's hard to imagine now, but that's one of the things that made Star Trek such a standout, was that filmed science fiction. You got maybe one or two movies a decade that were decent. You got a lot of crap, and then TV was just a joke. You finally got Twilight Zone, but it was an anthology. You got Lost in Space, which quickly turned into a joke. So no one respected science fiction on film. So he was like, he was against the current there. But people at the con were happy to see it, and he actually modeled that. There's pictures of him and her wearing that in their costume show. But Bjo and John ran that costume show. They'd been part of mainstream lit fandom, sci-fi fandom for ages. There was no need to divide it into lit and media fandom back then, because it wasn't big enough to be more than just sci-fi fandom. And very soon after that, they were in touch and went everything from working on what became the Concordance, which actually was another woman that started writing it, but basically encyclopediaizing. She was the Okudas before the Okudas were the Okudas, as far as the encyclopedia goes. Or before I did my Concordance, I modeled mine on hers with a lot of tweaks. But she did a fan version of that. But then, even more famously, she ran the initial Star Trek Enterprises for Gene and Majel. If it was flat and it would go in an envelope, we'll sell it because of the postage. And then got tapped to do the letter writing campaign, especially the second season one that actually got a third season for the original show, and made it more enticing to syndication and all the dominoes that fell in a good way because of that. So yeah, Bjo and John, and a lot of times we say Bjo and forget John, but Bjo and John together were a force. And then the first 10, 20 years, they were at, conventions all over. They had their lit fandom as well as their Star Trek fandom. And then when things kind of moved on, she was a big mover and shaker in the SCA, the medieval role-playing, persona, the Society of Creative Anachronism, or for Creative Anachronism. And she became big in fiberworks and dyeing and all that crafty bit, but she kept her hand in on the sci-fi side. And their kids grew up, and they lived in Texas, and they're back here in LA, but they're just like a living, you talk about a living encyclopedia, a living legacy, the folks they knew, and the actors and the sci-fi writers, and talking about firsthand just name dropping or firsthand stories from all the years of cons, much less the world cons, much less the Star Trek world and a lot of the Hollywood world. They're just amazing. And I've been very thrilled to have them on the Trek Files. And so if you ever get a chance to hear them talk, go meet them or just say hi, everybody. You want to do that. It's a direct not just to Star Trek, but to the original world of sci-fi before everything melted down and Hollywood got involved. And now we live a 24/7 Comic-Con culture, and everybody takes all this for granted. And it wasn't always that way. And I just love being around them, being able to talk, and in a legit format, especially be able to mine them. And like I said, we had them on the Trek Files talking about all of their Trek interface on the record.
So if anybody wants to check out that interview, go ahead. We'll have a link for it also in our show notes. And me personally, I'm hoping one day I get to have the Trimbles on my show as well, because I want to pay my respects as well. They're very important to this franchise, just as much as any of the actors and directors and anybody else out there are.
And it's sad the way the pendulum swings and the hot thing of the moment. When we went through that 12-year desert of at least no episodic Star Trek, you would think that the microscope would turn on, since there's nothing new coming from the studio. We would get introspective, and Fandom did a little bit, but there weren't a lot of new people coming in. But the last 5-10 years or so, I was glad to see the Trimbles invited to that event before Star Trek Beyond at Paramount in 2016. There's a lot of embracing, the history of Star Trek and Star Trek's fandom as well, because we wouldn't have a franchise without the fandom, without those people like John and Bjo and all those kids and adults that wrote, the letters in 67 and 68 and made a noise. We talk about fan ownership today. Well, that's the DNA of it.
Trek Untold will return momentarily. Trek Untold is brought to you by Triple Fiction Productions. If you're a Star Trek cosplayer looking for props, or toy collector looking to spice up your shelves, Triple Fiction Productions has you covered. Triple Fiction Productions produces affordable and unique 3D printed Trek-inspired products from the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the movies. You can expect the same amount of care and attention to detail in any of the items in their catalog, whether it's a prop replica for use in a fan film, or part of a cosplay, or accessories and playsets for figures from Playmates, Migos, or Diamond Select. Own your very own tricorder or phaser rifle with working lights, the bridge of the Enterprise E for your Playmates figures, or any other item from countless species and ships from the Star Trek universe. All products are 3D printed in the USA and are constantly evolving and improving based on fan feedback. To learn more about their products, visit them at triple-fictionproductions.net or on Facebook at facebook.com/triplefictionproductions. Triple Fiction Productions, taking Star Trek where no 3D printer has gone before.
Hi, I'm Armin Shimmerman.
And I'm Kitty Swink. 17 years ago, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I didn't know it at the time, but I had a 4% chance of surviving 5 years.
As her husband, I was very scared.
But he never let me see that. You are a rock.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pancreatic cancer is the third leading cause of cancer-related deaths in the United States, with a 5-year survival rate of just 10%.
We want it to be much higher.
Much higher. It's 6% better when I was diagnosed, but not high enough. More than 60,000 Americans are estimated to be diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2021, and more than 48,000 will die from the disease. Because symptoms are often vague, it can be hard to detect.
Like the rest of the world, the Star Trek universe has been struck repeatedly by pancreatic cancer. Not only those of us that work on the show, but our fans around the world as well. It is why we came together with so many others to work with the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, the leading patient advocates committed to fighting the world's toughest cancer.
PanCan is working hard to create better outcomes for this devastating disease through its groundbreaking research in early detection and better treatment options.
PanCan drives progress by funding life-saving research, providing personalized patient services, and creating a community of supporters and volunteers who will stop at nothing to create a world in which all pancreatic cancer patients will thrive.
You can help support their important mission by donating at pancan.org today. We donated. Won't you do so too?
Please, make it so.
We now return to Trek Untold.
So, Larry, I wanted to spend some time today talking about Star Trek conventions. Now, me personally, I've only actually ever been to one, unfortunately. I'm hoping to change that once we get out of COVID. I've gone to plenty of other Comic-Cons, and in fact, that's how I first found out about you, was when you came over to New York to do Big Apple Comic-Con, and you were, I believe, hosting Brent Spiner and David Gerald's panels. So
oh, wow.
That was my first time learning about Larry Nemecek.
That's the only New York convention in New York proper that I've ever been to as a guest.
Oh, okay. Well, we got to change that. So I got to go out and get to a proper Star Trek con, more so than the one I've been to, and you got to come here and do some more New York cons. But that's a different episode. I just kind of wanted to actually ask, what is your very first Star Trek convention experience? What do you remember from the first time you ever did it, and how did you feel about it? Because back, I imagine when you were going to cons, it's not like it is today, where I feel like now it's become so mainstream. I feel like a Comic Con or even a Star Trek con, 80s, 90s, 70s, if you want to go that far back, still was kind of very niche and maybe looked down upon.
Well, like I was saying, we had sci-fi cons, and then Star Trek became a thing that no one had ever seen before. And, 6-8 years before Star Wars, which wouldn't have ignited, Lucas wouldn't have got his loans and financing if it hadn't been for Star Trek exploding as this dead little show that refuses to go away and is more popular, after it's been canceled than it ever was on TV.
You're welcome,
And it's
George.
actually, not only just like people are excited, but it's selling books. Local stations are raking in the bucks because their ratings are sky high because this dead little show, So it was, it's America, and the capitalism, bucks are going to move things along as well as passion. And it's all related though. So, yeah, in fact, it was that first, like I was not in New York. I was a kid in Oklahoma watching things happen in New York and LA and those conventions, the original ones, and going, oh my God, the all Star Trek ones. And I hadn't even been to a convention of any kind. There was a little convention near me that a bunch of dealers did once or twice, and they were more nostalgia, old time radio, westerns, that kind of thing. Science fiction, when there was decent science fiction to be, whether it was bug-eyed monsters and giant radiated insects, or whether it was Day the Earth Stood Still, or Forbidden Planet. But that was kind of the realm. And Star Trek broke that open to where the new Trekkies were invading all the old school cons. And after they kind of got, the original gatekeeping was a little bit of well, this is nice, but you really need to study your classics and read some Heinlein or read some Asimov or read some, Verne. And finally they just got so fed up, and they were feeling outnumbered, because here come 2,000 Trekkies to a con that's got 500 LitCon people. And finally they said, maybe you guys should go off and do your own convention. And they did. And, we know, so beginnings of Comic-Con culture really was Star Trek splitting that off. And they all exist today. And, and there's large cons and small cons. But when you say, what was my first Trek con? I can say, well, my first convention of any kind was a day con my mom took me to, where the two guests were the guy that played Spanky McFarlane in Our Gang, and there was a DC Comics artist, and I'm not a comics book guy, so I didn't care. But that's the place where I first saw not only big, like somebody had 35 millimeter prints of Star Trek, and I saw Sitting on the Edge of Forever and Trouble with Tribbles on a big screen, like a big projector screen. And I also saw the bloopers for the first time, which blew me away, but the first time I went to a real overnight con, I was in college and went to Ocon, which was Star Wars had been out. And there were no Star Trek guests because it was still lit-ish, but they were embracing media because Star Wars and, the curve was way up on interest, and Star Trek was there. And I remember going in, but I remember thinking when I went to my first real con, my image of it was, I got a box in college and I put my tech manual, my medical reference, my blueprints, my making of books, my giant poster book set. Basically, I was thinking we're all going to go and sit around and talk about Star Trek's background. Like, that was my image of what fans did at a convention. So I packed all my books up and went, and I got there, and it was like, I didn't stop to think, well, there are other interests here besides Star Trek. Okay. But even among the Star Trek people, it's like, oh, some people are really getting off talking about the characters and writing fan fiction. Okay, I guess they can do that. So at the risk of coming off as shallow, it's funny. And the modern words we've, cosplay is like a 10, 15-year-old word now. And shipping is, you still say shipping to me. I think, well, is it FedEx or UPS? But I get it. But, but I was so wrong. But I projected me into fandom. I thought we're all going to sit around and debate and hash out, questions and mysteries and all that kind of stuff. The thing I do in my column in the print magazine ish, or somehow in the pages of the Stellar Cartography book, flesh out the background, fill in the gaps, smooth it. that's what I, or talk about who made the shows. That's what I thought we'd be. So I got educated real fast. And I remember the first movie, since he just passed, I remember the first movie I walked in a film room and saw was Silent Running. But yeah, and I met Russell Bates, who was an Oklahoma native American, who was one of the co-writers on How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. The only real Star Trek connection I had then was realizing that A, this guy wrote it and he lived in Oklahoma. B, he was Native American. C, he lived in Oklahoma and he had a connection to Star Trek, which immediately, and B, he came by and looked at all my medical props that I had hand built and said, this looks as good as anything we have in Hollywood. And I was like, oh, okay, yay. But yeah, that's the first Trek con I may have to say that it was the Con of Wrath. It may have to be the Ultimate Fantasy in '82 in Houston. That was all Star Trek for the first time that I went to.
And not to make you feel too bad, Larry, I wasn't even born yet, so apologies for that.
I knew the job was dangerous when I took it today.
I mean, neither of us is wearing a red shirt, but I feel like we both just got red shirted here. But we talked about how there's been I like how you put it, like deserts in the Star Trek timeline. How there's been
or the fallow years. That's what I also call it. Yeah,
good terms. Yeah, I like these terms. I'm going to steal those. So I feel like conventions were probably very important in also keeping the franchise alive and keeping interest in it, because again, up until the last few years, Star Trek was really not even on TV as much as it is now. So, in your opinion, were conventions actually important to keeping this franchise going, keeping it alive, bringing in new fans? Or was it just kind of like, we're all here and we're just watching our numbers dwindle until suddenly, Discovery's up back on the air?
Well, it's, different. Like I was not really I got in the very tail end of the first generation, because original Star Trek fandom was about celebrating the show like any fandom would do. But the subtext or the spine of Star Trek fandom was the revival. And it was the fan ownership angle of, how dare you cancel this show that's the most awesome thing ever seen in media or philosophy.
So it was almost like a protest rally.
This is the 18, 20-year-old, the best thing to ever grace American TV. It was so subversively radical, you don't even get it. And to build toward demanding, not asking, but demanding a return as a TV show or as a movie or something, like, you cannot let this die. The fan fiction was all about, you can't take my Star Trek away from me. If you're not going to give it to me out of Hollywood, I'll make my own. Yeah. That was a little more, of a snarky level to it. Some of it was just the passion drove that. But there was a level that's, you can't take this away from me. And I feel like I'm doing the Mal and of the Firefly theme here. But that happened, and that's why there's such an ownership to, so much so that when the animated series came out and some people were like happy, there was a chunk of fandom that said, oh no, you're not gonna satisfy us. You can't buy us off with this cheesy little Saturday morning cartoon that's probably going to be a crock and be pathetic and be embarrassing to watch. Oh no, we're not letting you off the hook. Boycott that. They think they're going to get away with this. There was a whole reaction against the animated series just because it wasn't live action, a series or a movie. So, and then we had the dance of the 70s, but original fandom was all about getting something back. And that's why anybody that watches the motion picture today, critique it as a piece of cinema, critique it and know about it as a piece of insane movie making business where they promised that date and it could have almost broken the studio if they hadn't, which is why it was rushed. All of that saga, but also look at it when people make fun of the pod going around the Enterprise. That was a reward to fandom for hanging in with them for 10 years. And people, to this day, anybody who was in the theater, the vast majority of people will defend that moment, even as it's such a memeable, people can make fun of that. But it's like, no, that was for you guys. We're spending money. This is what you had to have in your imagination for 10 years, and you hung in with us and did it. So that was early fandom. And then fandom was, there, and it kind of came through the movie era. And then Next Gen, you had those people wrapped up in that era. You had the faction who hated Next Generation because they thought the same thing. You're trying to fake us out with new people, and you can't slap Star Trek on this and think we're going to buy it because we know it's Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And, when we all love Spock and Vulcans and Ponfar and Kirk and Shatner and you're not going to put them out to pasture that easily. And I was young enough to say, shut up, you got what you wanted. It's new Star Trek every week. It's not even a movie, gang, So, but that's the kind of pendulum that happens. And when there's a downtime, every time there's been a comeback after a lull, the business model runs down like in '05 and peters out. And then J.J. Abrams, to his credit, when people thought, oh, this will be gone for 10, 20 years before they bring it back,
He reboots the entire series.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of this when you break the chain of the creative chain there. Sorry, I zoomed off for a second. I had a text. Whenever people are let go, he comes back, JJ comes back in and starts it up, but he's got to have a new take. And there's a little bit of ego and arrogance about, and it's just human nature. Anytime there's a gap or a long time down, the well-oiled machine has been left to sit there and rust. And then when new owners come and take it over, even through the movie era, even with Next Gen starting up, even with some familiar faces there's a lot who don't. And it takes a while for things to settle down. And every time there's been a startup like that, there's been a friction point, even with DS9 and Voyager and Enterprise, right? So it's like the worst thing sometimes about rooting for Star Trek is the fandoms. But I still think that there's a big, vast, silent majority who aren't the one, whatever the medium of the day is, whether it's letters and letterzine columns or it's email and Twitter. There's a vast silent majority that's just happy to see something happening, and they may critique it and have their favorites, but they're not bashing it because it's new, no matter what your points are. And everything like we're seeing now, Discovery's coming back, was a horrendous lesson in how not to start a TV show up again, just on its own. And then year by year has settled in. And then have there been follow-ups? Their well-oiled machine is getting better oiled and more sure of itself. And we're there. But yeah, fandom sometimes is its own worst enemy, but it's not about, most of the time, until we get to the bot and the troll era, like people being paid to stir up social, discord. But a lot of it still comes from people who love something so much, they get afraid when something changes. And it's like sometimes they mistake their fear turns to anger, and it's misplaced, and people it's almost like the penalty for loving something so much that you're on a trigger, to jump in, because you can talk to fans now. That's what we used to do about those people in '87 that were ranting about the Next Generation, which seems heretical now, or ranting about DS9, the show that didn't go anywhere, which seems insane now. Or you've got to remember now but you tell the young people now, well, we were watching week to week, and DS9 was on the hockey channel that would get bumped to 2 a.m. for every match, and if you missed a week, serial is great now, serialized, but back then, if you missed 2 shows, you were lost, on a week to week. So it's interesting how the fandom goes back and forth, and each one kind of is different, but it's been 55 plus years now. And I still say this, of all the media out there, we live in a Comic-Con world, and, Marvel and DC and Star Wars and Doctor Who and everything, there is nothing else. Star Trek's got its unique points, even on that pile of franchises people love to be a fan of. And as long as they keep the things that are the most unique about Star Trek versus everything else, hopefully it will always be. That's what I'm kind of on guard against. If we ever start blandifying ourselves even into something else that's popular, like a continuity of background, and that's a third rail and a little bit, and some people roll their eyes at that, but we don't reboot Star Trek every 2 years like Spider-Man and Batman, although now Spider-Man is going to use all the reboots as they're actually taking a card from Marvel, who would take a card from Star Trek about that. But anyway, that's going far afield.
Well, it kind of brings me up to this thing I've said on a lot of other people's shows when we start talking about the different iterations of Star Trek over the years and the decades. And for me, Star Trek is not a monolith. It can be whatever it needs to be. And, to be quite honest, part of that is the fact that Star Trek is a product at the end of the day. But more so, it's going to be always changing based on the times, based on who's looking at it, based on how we're viewing it. So it's going to always be an ever-evolving thing. And I think that kind of is a good segue to bring up the next topic, because you kind of touched on it. And that's gatekeeping within the fandom. And, again, I feel like we see that a lot. If it's not just gatekeeping saying, new Trek isn't my Trek, because we see that all the time on social media, it's also gatekeeping and saying, I know more than you, so my opinion is bigger than yours, and my opinion, therefore, is more credible than yours. So, you've been in this fandom a lot longer than I have, so I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on how gatekeeping has been a part of the Star Trek fandom and where we're at with it right now.
Yeah. Well, gatekeeping as a term is like, I want to say term 47, that we've always had the concept, but we didn't have the term until the last 5, 10, 15 years or something. But yeah, I mean, I go back to there. I used to call it lit snobbery. I'd put it the other way around,
I like
where
that term.
and they were good people. The people who were putting on our small model. When I started a media con as opposed to a lit con in Oklahoma City. It was Star Trek because I had sold the book, or just about to sell the book, and within 2 years we'd be in LA and be able to, funnel the new actors on Voyager and DS9 back to the con that I started in Oklahoma City. But I had to do that because some of you may know Richard Arnold, who was Gene Roddenberry's longtime assistant. He was on the lot from about Star Trek 4 time, but his mother had been in fandom in St. Louis and had done cons, and he grew up helping organize actors and knew the original cast from the early 80s, late 70s, and then was at Gene's right hand, and he passed away just a couple of years ago. But his downfall was in taking that sitting at the right hand of Gene a little too literally toward the end. But he had his place in history. I had wanted to. He was a cheap guest. He would go. We paid his airway and his hotel and his per diem, and he would come and he would bring slides and information and gossip from the right hand of Gene. And it's true in the movie days of the 80s that Gene was kind of he was trying to get his status back. But by 86, they were on the verge of getting cranked up for Next Generation. The news was just breaking. And I had a chance I had met him at a con, and I wrote and said, would you come to our convention here? Well, it didn't start that way, but it became under the ownership, the running of a lot of friends of mine, but they were very, this was a thing. I know how ridiculous this sounds now. They were very focused on their Worldcon resume, and heaven forbid they allow any actors or producers in, because it was all about the classics and all about the lit world and art, some sci-fi art. But I said, guys, there's a new show coming. I can bring Gene Roddenberry's assistant for like next to nothing. And they're like, oh, no, we don't want any media people. Well, heaven forbid we have media people on our flyer. And I'm like, okay, how about if we fundraise for him and do that? And they're like, well, okay, but he can't be on the flyer. Because they didn't want anybody they were trying to impress to put in a Worldcon bid. Like that was their empire, and that was their blinders. And they were like, so if I do my separate flyer to say he's here, that's okay, but he can't be in the guest of honor list. No. Okay, but otherwise go for it. Okay, well, we make the money easily. He comes. He'd also just seen my copy of my concordance, and he was madly copying for everybody back in the writer's room, even as it was, chaotically turning over, which helped, I guess, in the chaos. But that's the attitude that I used to just marvel at. And then within a year or 2 or 3, after I started my media convention, ThunderCon, it got to the point where we were having, even in those days, even with our meager resources and pre-internet to spread the word, we were having 800, 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 people. And good old CinderCon, which is now in a different phase, but back in the day, they were still hanging at 300 and 500 people. Then I got accused of working harder on that than the other. I'm like, no, you can sell an actor faster than you can sell an author that nobody's heard of. You can get them in publicity. You can get stations that are carrying the show to come in and it was just the modern world that we live in now. But it was, and so if you want to say that's gatekeeping, if you want to say that was, sometimes that's going along with blinders on. But that kind of thing has been around. I mentioned the original LitCon people that told the Trekkies in New York to go to start their own con instead of like overrunning us, because we're not gonna cater to your every whim talking about Spock. We have real science fiction to talk about. So fast forward, now we're all splintered up and bifurcated, and the fandoms get along and the franchises get along, or they don't. And even within Star Trek, I still think a lot of this is ginned up on the side. We've always had people that had loud opinions, like the zine world that didn't like the coming of Next Gen, all down the line. It's always been there, but eventually it's always been kind of like, okay, well, if you want to live in that world, you can be the loud 10% over there and do that. But most of the rest of fandom has either got no opinion or it's moving on. And then what happens is over time, enough time goes by that you bring these historical nuggets out and tell them to current fans, and they're looking at you like you're insane, right? There was a time when I was first in fandom and I was reading Interstat, which was the highest level of corresponding fans, and there were about 5 guys like me that cared about backgrounding, and the rest was all the women authors arguing over Spock and zines and fan fiction and everything. And that's fine, but I just knew, and I would read it and I would see what the trends were, but it wasn't what my passion was. I was still on a hunt to see if anybody there were anybody else's like me. But that's where I found out about the faction of fandom that you talk about, like canceling Enterprise or canceling Discovery or something. There was a faction that canceled the 3rd season because Spock had been so bastardized in Enterprise incidents and talking to Droxine and the Cloudbinders that's not the Spock, and Gene wasn't running the show, so that wasn't really Star Trek to them. So they just ignored the 3rd season. There was a whole faction of fans that Star Trek to them ended after the 2nd season. And I just remember going, okay, I get it. They're not as good as shows, but really? So you bring that one out today and people just look at you like you're crazy. So I'm all geared up for today. It's like, guys, and now we got more choices than we've ever had. It's like me in 87 times 10. Just find one that you like. The other thing is that nothing is static. A show starting up is going to be very rough. And we talk about this with Discovery a lot. Like, come back and revisit it. Next Generation's first season. My God, people.
It's
like, how much further do you need to look than there, right? Yeah.
So it's always fun, like, looking back on Treks, because usually half the time, like, in my opinion at least, I feel like you have to look at a Trek series as a whole. You can't really pull out a few episodes because you might pull a real stinker or you might pull a real amazing 5-star episode, but it's got to be balanced, and you got to kind of look at it all as one giant lump together. Kind of back onto topic here, I feel like we're kind of getting into an area that is really interesting to me, and that's toxicity of the fan base. And I never knew the story you told me just now about season 3 with the Cloud Miners. Like, that's surprising to me, and that I feel like is an example of a toxic fan also. And my question here, it's going to be twofold, but when I think of toxicity, I hear things like the Star Wars franchise and how those fans have been heard are accused of being toxic. Or one of the ones that makes me really sad is how fans will accuse the Steven Universe fandom of being toxic, which is so sad to me. And I hope it's not true. But I'm curious if Star Trek has avoided becoming a toxic fan base. And more so, my follow-up to that is because, we're looking at right now a real line in the sand on social media in particular. And that line in the sand is drawn between what feels like 2 warring factions. We have like our left-wing Star Trek fans and our right-wing Star Trek fans. And they always come to heads, especially now because of the quote-unquote new Trek. We're seeing folks who are unhappy with LGBT representation. They're unhappy with seeing, not enough white people on a bridge, things like that. And so they're always coming to heads over these social issues. And so, we're talking about toxic fandom here. My thing is, too, on top of that, how can Star Trek fans have such a huge philosophical difference when it comes to a show that's always been so forward-thinking? And who the heck is actually toxic in this situation?
Yeah. Well,
to unpack.
We throw these terms around now. So to me, when somebody says toxic, like I said, everybody's going to have an opinion. We used to have, the good old fan bar fights, or sitting around the table at the club meeting, or the early days of Facebook having, debates back and forth. And sometimes that's how you re-examine, you brought along some assumptions. Maybe there was a corner of some show or series that you forgot about. And even though now you can instantly go and, check it out, whether you could do that quickly or not, that would happen. And then you're going, oh, maybe it was the show that just aired this week and you missed something. I saw that pop up talking about why does Vance not know that they've been through the galactic barrier already? And it's like, well, then remember, I mean, you could go through that. So, but to me, if you say toxic, that's where it goes beyond just having differences and critiquing and having a debate. Toxic is where it gets rude and mean and even on the verge to dangerous, right? And you're hounding people. And that feels like that's coming in from the outside culture, just in politics in general. So I do know, I used to love dealers who would be at a Comic-Con where all the franchises were there, and I would talk to them, especially when we were filming for the Con of Wrath. And they would say, the Star Trek fandom is the nicest fandom out there. Now, I know there are corners of Trek fandom who have had scars and bruises from online battles who would say, what do you mean Star Trek is the nicest fandom? But like overall, I think that's the DNA of Gene and Idic and Infinite Diversity and all the original things, again, that I think most of, fandom is imbued with. That's the guiding, motivating force for Star Trek. And here's where I say, we talk about what's happening online. Online fandom is just a sliver of the whole fandom, just like live convention fandom is a sliver of fandom. I call the armchair fans, and maybe now I should call the mobile viewer fans. They're just out there watching the shows and enjoying them. They may pick up the novels, they get action figures, they build a model kit. They don't go to conventions, and they're sure not online 24/7. So sometimes, our perspective is skewed because that's where we stay, maybe, or we go there once or twice a week or 3 times a week. And it's like, oh my God. But yeah, that it's definitely up because I think that's just in the culture. But I also think if we ever have the opportunity to, like, when you go to a live con, how many times have you actually seen somebody who's up the equivalent of up in your face screaming or running around trying to, physically restrain people from going to hear people talk or whatever? That's crazy. So it's somewhere between, it's kind of the culture, which is something we need to do across the board. It's the coming of social media and all the algorithms that are funneling negativity at us, which really wasn't the intent in the beginning, but it's like algorithms are like magnets. And once we look at one thing, then it starts a flood. And, people, the whole train wreck, car crash on the side of the highway, and everybody slows down to look at it. Kind of, that's just human nature. But it's like, if we just sit back and realize who are the real people we talk to and we meet live. To me, that's part of it. And the gatekeeping thing, it's when differences of opinion and critiques get weaponized, basically. And sometimes somebody's doing it for a reason, maybe even, for some silver, or people just get carried away. But this whole thing about liberal and conservative, I remember in the 80s hearing, in the Reagan era, that's when I really first noticed it, and realizing that the first time I ever realized, I thought of a conservative Star Trek fan. I'm like, did you not watch the show? Did you not get that? And now we kind of had this, now it's like on steroids, but realizing that is it as simple as saying they're the people that they're the space battles and the pew pew people and everything else went right past them? Or maybe as a younger person, they were, that old thing about you're more liberal when you're younger and you get, by the time you pay bills and have kids and endure some life, scrapes, that you get a little more conservative or you're not as out there. I don't know. And that's an aging fandom. Maybe as we recharge the fandom and we have more young people coming in, especially with Prodigy, yay. It's not just about selling action figures. It's, getting them when they're young. Maybe that will kind of swing back, but I know what you're talking about, but I still don't think it's a 50-50. I know I'll go there. In 2016, when Trump was running, there was a group, I got in with 4 or 5 people who started a Facebook page it was basically called Trek Against Trump. And there was a pushback on it. But when you looked at the end of the weird thing was the other side wasn't anybody really noteworthy. There were maybe a couple of actors, but basically it was fans getting all harumphy about it. Okay, that's cool. That's fine. At the end of the day, between the celebrities and just the fans who had joined this page, it wound up being like 38,000, 36,000 to 200 or 300. Just as a simple a thing, it's not scientific, but just a simple thing as liking a page and having a statement about, this is Star Trek, this is what Star Trek believes in. We don't think that's what this guy running is all about, and we urge you not to vote for him. And it was about 5 or 6 paragraphs. And the other page was like, it took that and totally, it was like trying to be cute by taking it and exactly flipping it. And it wasn't outrageous. It just said the other thing. And at the end of the day, and I've got screenshots, at the end of the day, one was, 10,000 times more likes than the other. So that's kind of where I go back to. It's just that when you hear something jarring, it registers. It's, I used to talk about the loud 10% when we would talk about the people who hated Next Gen at the beginning. And I'd say this is jarring. And I'm talking about just reading it in letter zines and letter comments. And they throw you when you see them. But if you sit and look at it in the light of day, how much of fandom is that? How much of it is right in the channel you're in? And then how much of the fans in real life who aren't active what do they think? Aren't most of them thrilled to have a Star Trek back? And they'll sit with it as they know it may be wobbly at the beginning or whatever. But the basic premise isn't evil.
I mean, I'd love to think that way more so, but I can make some examples here. It's like, and as someone who has a YouTube channel, I'm sure you probably deal with this too. I could put up a video on my channel and I'll basically say whatever. I'll say something out there and I'll get a lot of good comments. Then I'll just get like that one negative comment, and it could just be one person, but that one person's voice always feels so much louder because it's negative. And I feel like that's what we see on social media, because that is what the fandom is now. And that's how people find the fandoms, is they find something they like, they want to get a little more into it. So the first place they go is social media. They try and find people who are into the same thing that they're into. And that leads down this rabbit hole where it can be good, it can be bad.
Yeah. And sometimes, especially younger fans, how they know to find things, the metrics, they'll go look at, they'll Google it, and then they'll look at what's the number of subscribers or likes or views. And sometimes the most toxic, the most negative thing, again, it's the highway, it's the car crash, it's the train wreck on the side of the road situation where everybody slows down to look at it, even though it's like it's appealing to the baser part of your instinct. It's almost like you can't overdo it, but you drive on. It's not like it's ruined your whole life. And when you adapt that to not so much the algorithm finding you, but even when you first sit down to start looking and you go, oh, this guy must be popular. He's got 180,000, views or subscribers. And then, it's that. And some of that is like legacy that hangs on. I will say, when I was first living on Trekland Tuesdays Live, and it was just my phone and me on a gimbal, and I was hand scrolling to look at the comments. The first year I did this was really, really huge, and it, overlapped with the coming of Discovery and kind of blindsided a lot of people. But when it looked like I call them the toxic tubers, looked like they were going to just take over, and anybody that was coming to fandom was being skewed by these people or being chased off. Like they came in with the basic Trek optimism that we were all glad to have Trek back to address that and what was going on in the world. And if they're being run off by this just, wave after wave of hate, basically, and negativity and everything, nothing is good. It's all bad. I was really starting to wonder, like, where's the mainstream? Are we just not swiveled over to YouTube to attack this, much less the other social channels? And one of my Tuesday topics was, I always remember that, I called it "Who Mocks the Mockers?" It's like I'm doing my bit, but somebody's got to come along and help out. And I think within the next 2-3 years, some of this was just time going by. And it was really easy to like jaw on and on about, CBS All Access and paying for Star Trek. That's not what God intended. And, meant for it to be free. And there was all of this layers of stuff time was going to take care of some of that as the world just kept evolving. And now everybody juggles their apps and gripes about it maybe, but they don't take it out on Star Trek. But, just some of that was time going by. And as more of these series were rolled out, now I talk about, we have a buffet of Star Treks, and it's okay not to have one be your favorite. There were tons of people that didn't like DS9, they liked Voyager, or vice versa, or they didn't like either one, and they just kept watching Next Gen. I mean, we had it in a microcosm, and now it's all on steroid. We've got digital, we've got apps and streaming, and the business model has changed, and it's a different world in some ways and the same in others. But eventually it looks like, and some good streamers have come up, and it looks like now, we just talk about this every so often lately here after 4 or 5 years, it looks like a lot of at least in Trek, the toxic tubers have been kind of, I don't want to say beat down with a stick. It's more like they've been laughed out of the room, and like no one's paying attention. And the joke about, how many times has Alex Kurtzman been fired? How many times has Discovery been canceled? It's a joke now. And they've been laughed out. It's kind of like laughing at the energy vampire in Day of the Dove, So that's kind of, eventually some of these things, time takes care of it, and the pendulum swing and all that. But I feel bad for the people who come in unawares, and they've got nobody to give them any context or history and all that. And they're just sitting there trying to find something fun on their phone or their pad or whatever. And, they get sucked into that. And hopefully they either, hopefully they see something else, or the power of those are going. Now in the other fandoms, it's really sad. I mean, you mentioned Star Wars and some of the other fandoms. That's the time when maybe having the more numbers, it's hard. That's a bigger battleship that's harder to turn. That's my thoughts. We just are out here plugging along. And I just think the more new Star Treks they put down, and the better a shape they are when they start,
Yep.
And I think the animated series, both in their own ways, have blown people away. I think people are getting it now to where don't lump, the people that lump all these shows in with the Kelvin movies and just go yuck, 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 yuck. It's like, wait, there's a huge difference between Discovery and Picard. And I'm amazed at people that don't, they lump them together like they're twins. And it's like, they're not. There's most of Picard I enjoy a lot more than Discovery, but I'm not saying I hate Discovery. I'm just saying I watch Discovery. I want to see what's going to happen with it. I want to see, the little bits and pieces. I'm surprised all the time. But overall, I just feel like Discovery started with it had such a troubled birth that it's been trying to get over its rough birth ever since. And, where Picard started more out of the gate, and my God, Lower Decks and Prodigy started incredibly well formed. And now we're all excited for Strange New Worlds. So, but that's the reality. It's not that there's just this monolithic to everything after 2005. That's just silly. And the time will also take care of that, because eventually, just like the people that hated Next Gen at the beginning because it wasn't real Star Trek, because it wasn't Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and who's this bald captain? Are you kidding me?
He's so old.
Yeah, he's so old, and he's French, and he has an English accent, and he's bald. Get out of here! What? Don't try to sop me with these replacements. I mean, that was, that's laughable now. It's understandable and it's historical, but it's laughable now. But back in the day, at the speed we moved along at, that was a chunk of, angry fandom at times. And so time will take care of all of this. We just have to survive and put our best foot forward and just pay attention. And not, so many people are still stuck with, there are still people today, as DS9, with the Netflix revolution became, well, it looks to be the Star Trek that's actually stood up to the test of time the best. And every once in a while, that's kind of that's a meme in itself. But every once in a while, I'll still run into people that go, oh my God, DS9 is so horrible. If you miss one episode, you're just totally lost. And it's like, this is 2022, not 1992. It's okay. You can stream it and binge it. It's going to be fine.
Yeah, exactly. You can basically find a way to watch it. It's not that hard. You can easily find that missing episode now. And basically kind of bring us back to things here. You and I, we can't really solve this dilemma in the course of 1 hour in a podcast episode, but I think we can both agree that there's no wrong way to be a fan, whether you're a casual or you're a hardcore fan, as long as you're not hurting someone else. And that's, I think, where we kind of draw the line in toxicity. Is if you're trying to rain on someone's parade, that's where the problem lies. Yeah.
And I will include people who are like, if you're a costumer, if you're a cosplayer, costume builder, I'll even say, or if you do CGI models or you build props. I mean, I remember seeing kids wearing powder blue Spock shirts that looked atrocious, but did I walk up and go, well, this is horrible? I mean, it's like you're encouraging. Are you in some kind of master class competition where that's the scale of the judging? No, just enjoy everybody. You don't have to snark out or prove how great you are. And some of this is just, I hate to say it, but some of it's just our younger fans, and it's just the immaturity or not having lived a lot of life experience. The years going by and just living some life out there and bumping into people of different, and sometimes you're on the top and sometimes you're on the bottom and sometimes you're in the helpless middle. So just as we get our corners rounded down a little bit, that again, that kind of takes care of that. But yeah, it's celebrate everybody for what their passions are. And look, we went through 10, 12 years where the powers that be, and a lot of us were worried that unless Trekkies were making babies, we were going to die out. I mean, seriously, will we ever see action figures on sale at Target and Walmart again? Well, now we are. We've got a franchise going. We've got shows aimed at kids, but it's we can breathe easier that way. It's not just going to be this aging fandom that whines itself into the grave or whatever. We're going to have a good mix of people from all backgrounds and ages and where they came into Star Trek, and they're all going to bring their own worldview and how they grew up and where and how and what they bring to their Trek, much less what Trek they bring. And it's all good. It's all good. We'll be fine.
And what I think is really interesting too about the fandom right now, at this current moment, let's just say, is the fact that we are still dealing with COVID-19, but we're hopefully at a tail end of it now. And I know so many people who I work with or who I've become friends with, and they basically just started watching it as like their pandemic project. They started watching TNG if they're like my age, and now they're like, they might not be super hardcore, they might not be going to a convention, but they're so into TNG and they love it and they respect and admire Star Trek to some level, and that's a big deal. So these folks are now getting into Star Trek during like one of the worst times ever in the history of the world, and they're just discovering something that they really like that they never knew they liked before. So as morbid as it might sound, and I wonder if you'll agree with me, I feel like the pandemic has actually been very good for Star Trek and for the boom period that we're in right now.
I think it slowed down the poor producers trying to keep up with the demand and trying to make like Paramount Plus, a year-round thing instead of like watching for a couple months and turning it off or whatever, or people cramming it in the free week. And I don't blame people for doing that. That's what it's there for. And hey, go for it. But aside from the pandemic interrupting and slowing down the flow of production, yeah, I mean, I was doing Portal 47. The core tech of that was my business coaches showed me free conference call 7 years ago. 7 years ago. And I've been doing coaching and learning and voiceover that way. And but I realized we could go behind the scenes. We didn't need a big business model. I didn't need to be a convention or a magazine, that we could have behind the scenes people who nobody has ever heard from before across all the eras. But I could use, a virtual streaming, a virtual private virtual conferencing to get that to people and have that be a business even. And so we had been free conference calling, and I'd been debating about doing Zoom, and then boy, the pandemic hits, and now the whole world Zooms. And I went ahead and flipped it over. But like I said, I'd been doing that for 4 or 5 years ahead. And I think, yes, one of the things may be this whole virtual component. So many people went there. A lot of the actors and other creatives went there to survive. Or if they didn't need to survive, they just gave of themselves, like Sir Patrick reading a sonnet every night, like all the Shakespeare sonnets once a day. I mean, little things like that. Sid, starting his Sid City social forum, but just fandom in general in the world getting used to this kind of a platform, and even YouTubers and podcasters making it way easier to do what they've been doing for a year or 2 or 5 or 10, just making it easier to do that. So people you can do more with less and less overhead and less, potential. So yeah, there'll be a lot of, and live events may have virtual streaming components, where that used to be a big experimental thing that at least one time I remember somebody losing their shirt trying to set that up about 15 years ago. But now it's easy to do, and maybe there'll always be a virtual connection even when people can go live. But it's global. It's made us global, and we can fight the time zones and be global too. So yeah, there'll be some good things coming out of this. But the fact that I just remember we had a opening night preview party here in Burbank for Picard, and 2 weeks later the world was shut down, and it was amazing how we snapped from the old to the new just in that span of just in that 10 weeks was kind of amazing. And now maybe we're going to be coming out of it, hopefully, on the next go around of Picard. But some aspects about the pandemic have been good. And your binge watcher, real quick, I was just at Gallifrey, which is a WhoCon, and Sean always says, well, Larry, who people have other interests too, and there's a lot of Trek people there that I know from LA and around the country. But I had 20, 30 people in my solo panel, and we always did our what Trek did you come in from, what's your most favorite now, and all of that. And people talking about it's about hearing fan opinions and me kind of leading it. And one young woman, I say young, she was post-student. She had to be 25, 28. She was talking about, she'd been quiet, and everybody else, they always skew older at conventions anyway. But she was talking about how the pandemic came along, and she was a geek of many franchises, but she'd never seen Star Trek, and she knew about it, and she had friends that were fans. And she decided, in pandemic, she's going to sit down and watch. She not only watched, she started with The Cage, went everything in order, in production order. When she got to the overlap of DS9 with TNG, she went back and forth like she was watching them in real time. And there are some sites, I guess, that have that all for you if you don't want to research it yourself. And then overlapped Voyager with DS9, and then would drop the movies in when they fell. And she to this day, where she's caught up with the latest Discovery and Prodigy having, she was caught up to today. And it was funny because she said, and boy, I get it when people are pissed about Discovery season 1. But yeah, a lot of people I think are out there like her, and if they're all 20 something, so much the better. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see there are a lot of ripples in play right now. It's a huge transition time, mostly for the good, I think. And it's going to be interesting to see how, our new fandom coming along, people in the middle, and watch older fans who aren't keeping up watch some of their blinders get challenged a little.
So, Larry, like we said, we're now confident, or at least we're optimistic, that we're on the tail end of this pandemic here. So, as you are the elder Trek statesman here, what are your hopes for 2022 and beyond in terms of what this community is and who we are and how we're growing?
Well, my hope would be that everybody just feels more comfortable in their skin. My hope is that external factors like politics and COVID especially can let us all kind of relax and enjoy what we enjoy, but also that people can enjoy the fact that, yes, some will be better produced than others, or some will just be a favorite to some and not as much a favorite to others. Just the way fandom has never been all one monolith. It was a shock to me to find out that not every fan was a background fan. What do they do with their fandom then if they're not talking about background? I mean, that we will find a way to relax and enjoy. Infinite diversity, infinite combinations is the good old trite way to Star Trek way to say it, and it makes the point. But just enjoy what you enjoy. We have never been so blessed to have this many choices, this buffet of Star Trek that we're going to be having. And the legacy shows aren't going anywhere. The legacy characters may even be revisited. So it's like we've never had this much content to choose among, and we've never had such great tech tools to enjoy it. We survived the pandemic thanks to virtual streaming. So it's like we've never had a time in fandom like this before. And eventually I hope everybody can just unclench, even with the cares of the world, but we can just sit back and enjoy what all we're into right now and get involved in all the best ways and find the friendships and have opinions and be respectful and do all those things that Star Trek is supposed to represent. And we will get to that future if we can all maintain that. But my gosh, we've got so much to enjoy right now if we'll just sit back and do it.
Yeah, we totally do. There is so much awesome new Trek coming out all the time now, especially this year. It's a smorgasbord. It's kind of amazing. It's a smorgasbord if we want to get punny, but I'm not going to do that to you because I already hit you up terrible Enterprise jokes like an hour ago. So,
well, people, smorgasbord is 15 or 20 years old, so don't worry about it.
I can't take credit for it, but I can totally just beat it to death. So, Larry, thank you so much for coming on today. You are a true ambassador of the community and of the fans, and that's why I had to have you here to really tackle this topic with me. Because again, you've been invested in this far longer than I have, and you are a true wealth of knowledge. And I hope you don't mind being so complimentary, because it's the truth. But you've really accomplished a lot of what you're doing, what you continue to do, and just how deeply invested you are in this fan base. So thanks for being a fan. Thanks for being Dr. Trek. And again, we appreciate all your time today, just chatting with us about so many different things, and just telling us all about how great this community really is and how great it can be.
Well, thank you, Matthew, and good luck with everything with Trek Untold. And you keep on this path. You're doing a lot of good yourself.
Oh, thank you so much.
Trek well.
That's it for this week's episode of Trek Untold. Shout out once again to Paul White for chatting with us and being one of the coolest guests we've ever had on this show. And of course, don't forget to check out AEW Revolution this weekend on pay-per-view, on Fight TV, or any place you go to watch live premium sporting events. This has the potential to be one of the most intriguing, one of the most fast-paced, one of the most hard-hitting, and easily one of the most violent AEW pay-per-views that we've seen in quite some time, and I think it's going to be one that goes down in the history books, so don't miss it. Until next time, please don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you're in a position to financially support the show, please consider becoming a supporter over on patreon.com/trekuntold, or pick up some merchandise from our Redbubble store. If you're looking for direct links for any of these things, links will be right in the show notes. If you have any questions or comments for the show, or would like to suggest a guest, or discuss any sponsorship ideas with us, send me a message at trekuntold@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to Trek Untold and for continuing to support this show. I hope you'll come back next time to learn more stories about Star Trek and beyond. Until then, I'm Matthew Kaplowitz, and always remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com, promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the RageWorks podcasting network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.